The first time Hester Blackwell told a man she could not be loved easily, he laughed and rode away, and she had stood in the red dust of Redemption Creek watching him go without a single tear, because she had learned long ago that tears were a luxury she could not afford. That had been 3 years before Abraham Mercer arrived in town, and in those 3 years, Hester had built something that most women in the New Mexico Territory in 1878 would have called impossible. She had built a life on her own terms, which was not the same thing as a happy life, but it was a life that was hers, and she guarded it the way a hawk guards its nest, with talons and silence and the kind of stillness that could be mistaken for peace by someone who did not look too closely. Redemption Creek was a town that lived up to neither word in its name. There was no creek, not anymore. The summer of 1873 had taken it, dried it down to a pale scar in the earth, and what remained was a reddish gully that the locals used as a shortcut between the livery stable and the mercantile. As for Redemption, well, the town had a saloon, 2 churches that disagreed violently with each other on nearly every theological point, a sheriff who drank more than he ought, and a population of roughly 300 souls who were all, in one way or another, running from something. Hester ran the only boarding house. She had inherited it from her aunt, Dora Blackwell, who had died of fever in the spring of 1875, leaving behind a 2-story wooden structure with 8 rooms, a leaky roof over the east wing, a garden that produced more thorns than vegetables, and a ledger of debts that had taken Hester the better part of 2 years to settle. She had settled every last one of them, which was how people in Redemption Creek learned that Hester Blackwell was not a woman to be underestimated. She was 27 years old. She had dark red hair that she kept pinned up with ruthless efficiency, eyes the color of weathered copper, and hands that were permanently rough from work. She was not the kind of beautiful that made men stop on the boardwalk, but she was the kind of striking that made them look twice after they had already passed her, which she had always preferred. She wore a practical dark blue dress most days, an apron over it until supper was done, and she kept a small derringer in the pocket of that apron not because she expected to use it, but because her aunt had told her that a woman alone needed options. She had been married once, briefly. A man named Thomas Aldrin who had come through town in 1874 with soft hands and a silver tongue and promises she had wanted badly enough to believe. He had lasted 8 months before the wandering instinct took him back toward whatever horizon he was perpetually chasing. He had not bothered with a divorce. He had simply written a letter saying he was not coming back, and Hester had used that letter to start the fire in the kitchen stove on a cold February morning and had not spoken his name since. So when people in Redemption Creek talked about Hester Blackwell, they said she was hard. They said she was cold. They said she had a wall around her that no man had ever gotten close to scaling, and that any man who tried was wasting his time. The women said it with a kind of resigned pity. The men said it with a wounded pride that she found both predictable and exhausting. She did not think of herself as hard. She thought of herself as honest. She knew what she was. She knew what she carried. And she had decided long ago that it was kinder to tell people the truth at the beginning than to let them learn it the painful way. She could not be loved easily. That was the truth. She pulled away when things got close. She went quiet when tenderness was offered. She found ways to push back, to test, to make the ground unsteady beneath the feet of anyone who tried to plant themselves too near her. It was not something she did on purpose, at least not entirely. It was something that had grown into her over years, the way a tree grows around a nail. The thing became part of the structure, impossible to remove without doing damage. She had made her peace with it. And then Abraham Mercer rode into Redemption Creek on a Thursday afternoon in late October of 1878, and her peace began to come undone in ways she did not expect and could not quite explain. She first saw him from the window of the boarding house, where she was changing the linens in the front room. He came up the main road on a bay horse that had clearly been ridden hard for several days, both of them dusty, and road-worn in a way that spoke of long distances traveled. He was tall, she could see that even from the window, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair under a battered hat that had seen more weather than most men in town owned. He stopped in front of the boarding house and looked up at the sign she had painted herself the previous spring, BLACKWELL house. Clean ROOMS. Fair rates. And something about the way he looked at it suggested he was reading it carefully, which was not as common as it should have been. He came through the door without slamming it, which was the first thing she noted in his favor. Most men came through doors like they were storming fortifications. She came downstairs to find him standing in the front hallway, hat in his hands, looking at the small painting of the New Mexico landscape that hung above the side table. It was a painting her aunt had done, clumsy but sincere, all ochre and pale blue, with a thin line of mountains along the horizon. "I'm looking for a room," he said when he heard her on the stairs. He turned, and she got her first clear look at his face. He was perhaps 31 or 32, with dark eyes and a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days. There was a directness to his gaze that she noticed immediately, not the aggressive directness of a man trying to establish dominance, but something quieter than that, something that felt more like genuine attention. "I have 2 available," she said, coming the rest of the way down the stairs and moving behind the small desk she kept near the door. "Weekly rate is 60 cents. That includes breakfast and supper. Noon meal is an extra dime." "That's fair," he said, and she waited for the inevitable negotiation, the way men always tested her prices, but it did not come. He simply reached into his coat and produced the coins. "I'll need it for at least a month, maybe longer depending." "Depending on what?" she asked, because it was a practical question. Long-term boarders had a way of shaping the character of the house, and she was particular about who she kept under her roof. "On how long it takes me to settle some business with a land claim," he said. "I'm not here to cause trouble if that's what you're wondering. I'm a surveyor. Government survey work mostly." She studied him for a moment. Surveyors were not uncommon in the territory. The government was still trying to sort out the chaos of competing claims that had accumulated since the end of the war, and men with the skill to draw accurate maps were in steady demand. "I'll put you in the back room upstairs," she said. "It's quieter than the front. The man in room 3 snores." Something crossed his face at that, not quite a smile but the precursor to one. "I appreciate the warning." "Supper is at 6, she said. "I expect guests at the table on time or to send word if they'll be late. I don't keep food warm indefinitely." "Understood," he said. She handed him the key. Their fingers did not touch. She was deliberate about that. His name was Abraham Mercer. She learned the rest of it in pieces over the following days, the way you learn a landscape not all at once but through repeated passing, through the gradual accumulation of small details. He was from Missouri originally. He had come west after the war, which was not unusual. A great many men had come west after the war, either because they had nothing left behind them, or because they needed the kind of space that only open country could provide after years of close and terrible violence. He had learned surveying under a man named Patterson who had worked for the General Land Office, and he had been doing it ever since, moving from territory to territory as the work demanded. He was quiet at the supper table, but not in the uncomfortable way. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, he said things that were worth saying, and he did not perform his opinions the way some men did, loud and insistent, requiring the room's agreement. He held his own views with a kind of easy confidence that did not need external confirmation. The other boarders responded to him the way most people responded to genuine steadiness, with something between relief and suspicion. There were 4 other long-term boarders at Blackwell House at the time, a widowed schoolteacher named Mrs. Croft, who was 50-something and deeply opinionated about everything, a young man named Pete Garrow who worked at the telegraph office and was perpetually in love with whichever girl had most recently smiled at him, a cattle agent named Henderson who was almost never there, and a retired army man named Calloway who had a wooden leg from Shiloh and drank his coffee like it had personally wronged him. They absorbed Abraham Mercer into the rhythm of the household with relatively little friction, which Hester noted with something she refused to call relief. What she could not avoid noting was that he was the only person in the house who consistently looked at her, not through her, not past her, not at the space slightly beside her that most people seemed to direct their attention to when they spoke to her. He looked at her directly, with the same quality of attention she had first noticed in the hallway, and it was more unsettling than she had anticipated. He did not flirt. She was accustomed to the boarding house variety of flirtation, the clumsy compliments, the lingering at the desk, the comments about her cooking that were really comments about her domestic suitability. He did none of that. What he did was talk to her like she was a person worth talking to, which was, she was embarrassed to discover, more disarming than any amount of flattery would have been. It started with small things. He noticed that the water pump handle on the back porch had a crack in the iron and mentioned it to her without making it a production. He fixed it the following morning before she had come downstairs, using a piece of metal banding he had found in the shed, and said nothing about it at breakfast. She noticed and said nothing either, which meant that between them there existed a small, wordless understanding, which was a more intimate thing than she had expected. He asked her about the painting in the hallway one evening after supper, when the other boarders had drifted away to their various occupations and she was clearing the table. "Your aunt painted it," she said, because she had mentioned Dora to him once in passing. "Was she from here originally?" "No. She came out from Tennessee in 1861 with my uncle. He died before they finished traveling. She set the plates on the kitchen sideboard and came back for the cups. She stayed anyway." She said there was no point going back to a place that held nothing but the memory of a person. He was quiet for a moment. "That seems like wisdom. Or stubbornness," she said. With Dora it was often hard to tell the difference. He smiled at that, a real smile this time, not the precursor but the thing itself, and it changed his face in a way that she found she needed to look away from. She went back to the kitchen and stood very still for a moment with her hands on the edge of the sink, which was not something she would have done over a man's smile 3 weeks ago. She told herself it was simply that he was easy company. That was all. He was a quiet, steady, decent man who asked sensible questions and did not require managing, and after years of difficult men and difficult situations, she found the contrast notable. That was all it was. She repeated this to herself several times over the following week, and found the repetition less convincing each time. The incident at Fuller's Mercantile happened on a Wednesday in early November, and it was the first time she saw what Abraham Mercer was made of in a situation that mattered. She had gone to collect a delivery of salt, flour, and coffee, and had found Ben Fuller in a state of high aggravation over a dispute with one of the Crandall Ranch hands, a man named Doogie Sims who had a reputation for petty cruelty and a tendency to become more of himself after 2 drinks. Sims was in the Mercantile when Hester arrived, drunk even at 11 in the morning, and he had been saying things to Rosario Vega, who worked behind the counter and who was 18 years old, and who had the misfortune of being beautiful in a town where some men had no manners about beauty. Hester put her list down on the counter and looked at Sims steadily. "That will do," she said, in the tone she used when she meant it entirely. Sims turned his bloodshot eyes on her. "Stay out of it, Widow Blackwell," he said, using the title people had started giving her after Thomas Aldrin's disappearance, partly out of convenience and partly, she suspected, because the word widow implied something finished, something settled, something safely in the past. "I am not a widow," she said, which was something she said regularly and had learned to say without the old tightening in her chest. "And I said that will do. Leave the girl alone." Sims stepped toward her in the way drunk men with something to prove step toward people, not quite threatening but thoroughly unpleasant. And that was when the door opened and Abraham Mercer walked in with his surveying satchel over one shoulder and a list of supplies he had mentioned at breakfast he needed to collect. He read the room in about 4 seconds. She could see it in the way his eyes moved from Rosario, who was pressed back against the shelves, to Sims, to Hester, to Sims again. "Sims," he said pleasantly, "the word over at the saloon is that Crandall is looking for you. Something about a fence line he needs rowed by afternoon." It was a deflection, nothing more, smooth and quiet and effective. Sims blinked, recalibrated, and then the belligerence went out of him the way air goes out of a bellows all at once. "Right," Sims muttered. "Yeah, all right." He pulled his hat down over his eyes and walked out past Abraham without another word. Rosario let out a breath. Ben Fuller said something grateful and largely incoherent. Hester looked at Abraham, who had already set his satchel on the counter and was consulting his list as though nothing particularly notable had occurred. Was any of that actually true? She asked him, quietly enough that only he could hear. About Crandall wanting him. "I have no idea," he said without looking up from his list, "but it seemed like the right thing to say." She looked at him for a long moment. He glanced up then, and there was something in his eyes that she could only describe as understated humor, the kind that comes from a man who is genuinely amused by the absurdity of human behavior without being contemptuous of it. "Thank you," she said. "You were handling it fine," he told her. "I just hurried it along." That evening, after supper, she found herself sitting on the back porch longer than she usually did, watching the stars come out over the desert in their thousands, and she realized she was thinking about him in a way that had shifted from the merely observational. She was thinking about the quality of his quietness. She was thinking about the specific way he had said she was handling it fine, with no condescension and no performance, just simple acknowledgement. She was thinking about his hands, which was the sort of thought she categorized quickly and firmly and set aside with the discipline of long practice. But the category did not quite hold the way it used to. Mrs. Croft cornered her in the laundry the following morning with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for precisely this opportunity. "He is a very decent man," Mrs. Croft said, without preamble, vigorously wringing out a shirtwaist. "A person notices these things." "A person notices many things," Hester said, and kept her eyes on her work. "He looks at you," Mrs. Croft said, which was not a particularly subtle approach, and Hester credited her for not pretending otherwise. "Not in the way of those others, in a particular way." "Mrs. Croft," Hester said, "I am simply making an observation." "Make it somewhere else, please, Mrs." Croft made a sound that managed to convey both respect for the boundary and complete unwillingness to genuinely honor it, and went back to her laundry with the satisfied air of a woman who had planted something and was confident in the soil. The first real conversation, the first one that opened something she had not expected to open, happened on a Sunday afternoon in mid-November. The weather had turned, as New Mexico weather had a way of doing, cold and clear, with a sky so blue it looked painted. Most of the boarders had gone to one church or the other. Hester did not attend either of Redemption Creek's churches, which had scandalized the town briefly when she first arrived and was now simply accepted as part of her particular character. She was sitting on the front porch with her mending when Abraham came outside with a cup of coffee. He paused at the door. "Do you mind?" he asked, gesturing toward the other chair. "No," she said. He sat down, and for a while they were both quiet in the way of two people who do not need to fill silence with noise, which was a compatibility she had rarely found. "How long have you been running this place alone?" he asked eventually. 3 years, she said, "since my aunt died." "It's a good house," he said. "There's a warmth to it even when the temperature doesn't suggest it. That comes from the person running it." She glanced at him. He was looking out at the road, not at her, which somehow made it easier to receive. "It's work," she said. "Mostly it's work." "Yes," he agreed. "But work done with care is different from work done without it, and anyone who stays here more than a week can tell the difference." She went back to her mending. After a moment she said, "Where will you go after Redemption Creek?" "I have a claim survey to finish in the territory, then likely up into Colorado. The government is redrawing a lot of lines up there." He paused. After that, I'm not entirely sure. I've been moving for a long time. I've been thinking it might be time to stop. And do what? She asked. Something worth staying for, he said, and then he looked at her and she looked at him, and the words sat between them in the cold air with a weight that was impossible to pretend was merely conversational. She looked back at her mending. I wouldn't put much stock in ideas about staying, she said, in the voice she used when she was being careful. People generally go where they mean to go, whatever they say before they get there. There was a pause. That sounds like something that was taught to you by experience, he said, carefully. Most things worth knowing are, she said. He did not push. He drank his coffee and sat with her on the porch until the cold drove them both inside, and he said nothing more about staying or going, and she told herself she was glad of that. She told herself that all evening. She was mostly unsuccessful. The days continued and accumulated into weeks, and the thing between them grew in the way of things that are not forced steadily, quietly, like water finding its level. He brought her wildflowers from the desert once, which she received with such a complicated expression that he laughed softly and said, "They're just flowers, Hester, not a proposal." And she had stood there holding a handful of dusty purple asters and felt something crack in her chest, something small but audible. She told herself it was the surprise of the gesture. She told herself it was the fact that no one had brought her flowers since she was a girl, since her mother had been alive, and the world had still been a place where that sort of softness was available to her. She did not tell herself the truth until the night of the storm. The storm came off the mountains on a Friday in late November with very little warning. A darkening in the west that moved too fast, a drop in temperature that arrived like a wall. By evening it was howling around the boarding house with the kind of violence that the high desert could produce when it chose to. Wind like a living thing. Rain that came sideways and found every gap in the wooden construction of the house. She spent the first part of the evening in the kind of organized crisis management that storms required, extra blankets distributed, buckets placed under the leak in the east wing, the stovepipe in the kitchen checked, the shutter on the upstairs window that had a weak latch secured before it could tear free. Abraham had appeared at the first sign of trouble and worked beside her without being asked, without needing direction, without getting in her way, which was its own remarkable thing, because most people either stood and watched or got in her way. By 9 o'clock the worst of it had settled into a sustained roar that they could do nothing about but wait out, and most of the boarders had retreated to their rooms. Mrs. Croft had made herself a hot toddy and gone to bed with apparent equanimity. Pete Garrow had gone to bed visibly frightened but too proud to say so. Calloway had gone to sleep at 8 as he always did, storms or no storms. Hester was in the kitchen. She had made tea, mostly for something to do with her hands, and she was sitting at the kitchen table listening to the wind try to peel the roof off the house when Abraham came in and said, "The shutter on my window came loose. I got it, but the latch is done. I can fix it properly in the morning if you have the hardware." "There's a box of latches in the shed," she said. "I'll show you where. No need to go out now. Tomorrow is fine." He looked at the teapot. "May I?" "There are cups on the shelf," she said. He poured himself a cup and sat down across from her at the kitchen table, and the storm continued to shake the world outside, and the lamp on the table threw a steady yellow light between them. "You're not frightened of it," he said. It was not quite a question. "I was the first few storms," she said. "After a while you learn that it ends, everything ends. That's either very comforting or very melancholy depending on how you hold it," he said. She looked at him. "How do you hold it? Tonight?" He considered this seriously, which was something she had noticed about him. He took questions seriously, as though they deserved the actual weight of thought. "Tonight it feels like company." Storms make the inside of a place feel more particular, more itself. She understood that exactly. She had never heard anyone say it that way before. They sat in silence for a while, and the wind sang its wild note around the eaves of the house, and the lamp flame bent slightly in the drafts, and she became aware of something that she had been half aware of for weeks, that she was comfortable. Not in the comfortable way of habit, not the comfort of the familiar and expected, but the specific and rare comfort of being with a person in whom you feel you do not need to perform being yourself, in whose company the ordinary self is adequate and even welcome. It frightened her more than the storm did. She set her cup down with a small, deliberate movement. "You should not get too attached to this place," she said, "or the people in it." He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "Why not?" "Because nothing in this town is what it appears," she said, and heard how that sounded and tried again. "Because I am not what it might appear, sitting here like this. I am not easy company in the long run. I am not good at the things that make a person worth. I am not made for—" She stopped, because she was saying it badly and she hated saying things badly. He set his cup down too. The storm howled. The lamp flame bent and recovered. "Tell me," he said quietly. And so she told him. Not all of it, not the whole of the Thomas Aldrin wreckage, not every silence and retreat and difficulty, but enough of it. That she pushed people away. That she did not know how to receive tenderness without flinching. That she had been told by someone she had trusted, that she was too much trouble for what she was worth, and that even though she had burned the letter that said it and had made herself a life and knew, in the rational part of her mind, that it was the cruelest possible lie, she still heard it sometimes in the dark. That there was something in her that closed doors before they could be closed on her. That she had learned to do it so well she was no longer always sure she was doing it on purpose. She said all of this to the lamp flame mostly, to her own hands on the table, and when she was done she was not sure what she expected him to say. Sympathy, perhaps. The gentle withdrawal that sympathy is sometimes a cover for, or nothing at all, which would also have been its own kind of answer. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him considering, not the hesitation of a man who does not know what to say, but the steadiness of one who does and is making sure he says it right. "Hester," he said. She looked up. "I'm not looking for easy," he said. "I never was." He held her gaze with that direct, unhurried attention that she had been trying to figure out for a month. "I am looking for you, specifically, whatever that comes with." The lamp flame bent again. Outside, the storm threw itself against the walls. She said nothing for a long moment, which was not nothing. It was the sound of something very carefully built beginning to consider the possibility of a different architecture. "You don't know what it comes with," she said, finally. "I know more than you think," he said. "And I'd like to learn the rest." She stood up and took her cup to the sink, and she stood there with her back to him for a moment, and she said without turning around, "Go to bed, Abraham. The storm will be done by morning." She heard him stand. She heard him pick up his cup. She heard him cross the kitchen, and he paused beside her, not touching her, just near, the way a person is near when they want to make the nearness known without it being a demand. "Good night, Hester," he said. "Good night," she said. She stood at the sink until she heard his footsteps on the stairs, and then she let out a breath that had been building for considerably longer than one conversation. The storm was done by morning. She had known it would be. What she had not known was that the morning would feel different from the mornings before it, the way the air feels different after rain, cleaned out, expectant, carrying the smell of wet earth and open possibility. He fixed the shutter latch after breakfast without making a ceremony of it. She watched him from the hallway for a moment and then went back to her work, and neither of them said anything about the night before, and that restraint was itself a kind of communication, a mutual understanding that what had been said was real and was being held carefully, and did not need the weight of daylight words to be true. The weeks that followed were different. Not dramatic, not punctuated by great declarations. Different in the way that light changes in a room when someone adjusts the curtain, the same room, the same furniture, the same daily life, but the quality of everything altered subtly. She noticed that she was not manufacturing reasons to be in a different room when he was in one. She noticed that she was not constructing the small evasions that were usually as automatic as breathing. She noticed, with a mixture of recognition and alarm, that she had told Mrs. Croft where to find the extra linens one Tuesday morning, and had done it because she was planning to take Abraham his surveying supplies that he had left on the kitchen table, knowing he had an early appointment across town, and she had wanted to get there before he left. She had gotten there in time. He had looked at the satchel, and then at her with a surprise that shifted into something warmer, and he had said, "Thank you," and the two words had landed differently from the way "thank you" usually landed. December arrived, and with it the particular beauty of a desert winter, cold, clear air, the mountains draped in early snow that came down to the tree line in a white edge, the sky so sharp it almost hurt. Redemption Creek was quiet in winter. The cattle drives were done, most of the drifting trade had drifted elsewhere, and the town settled into itself with the slightly sullen peace of a place that had been talked at all year and was finally alone. Hester had her own rhythm in winter. She baked more, which was partly the season and partly that fewer boarders meant more time in the kitchen. She repaired things around the house that summer had been too busy to allow. She read in the evenings, sitting close to the stove with her lamp pulled near, working through whatever the schoolhouse library had been willing to lend her. Abraham was still there. His survey work had extended further than he had initially expected, something about a disputed claim that required additional documentation, a legal complication that he was navigating with the help of the county agent in Santa Fe. He went out most days with his equipment, came back by late afternoon, cleaned up, appeared at supper. He had started helping her clear the supper table without being asked, which Mrs. Croft observed with the expression of a woman watching confirmation of a theory. He asked her one evening if she would show him around the town. Not the obvious parts, not the mercantile and the saloon and the sheriff's office, but the parts she actually found interesting. She thought about it for a moment. "Tomorrow," she said, "if the weather holds." The weather held. She took him to the gully that had been the creek and told him the story of the drought of 1873, which had changed the character of the town in ways that went beyond the loss of water. She took him to the old adobe wall at the east edge of town, which was all that remained of a structure that predated the American settlement by more than 200 years, and which most of the current residents walked past without a thought. She told him what she knew of the history of the land. The Pueblo people who had lived in this country long before anyone from the east had arrived to draw lines on paper and call it territory, and the way that history was written in the landscape if you knew how to read it, in the old field systems, in the ruins, in the names that English-speaking settlers had mangled but not quite erased. She had not talked this way in a long time. It came out of her in a rush, the knowledge and the feeling both, and she was several minutes into it before she became aware of it and looked sideways at him with something that was almost embarrassment. He was listening, actually listening, with the quality of attention she had come to associate specifically with him, full and unhurried and genuine. "Go on," he said. "I'm talking too much," she said. "You're not," he said. "Not even close." She looked at the old adobe wall. She said, "My aunt used to say that the land here had a memory, and that the worst thing you could do was move through it without acknowledging what it remembered. I used to think that was sentimental. Now I think she was right." "I think she was right too," he said. He had his surveying eyes on, the way he had when he was reading a landscape for its true proportions rather than its apparent ones. "Every line I draw on a map is a translation. Something gets lost. The original is always more complicated." They stood for a moment in the clear winter silence. The mountains were close in the cold air, the way mountains get in winter, the distance compressed, the detail sharp. She said, without meaning to, "I am glad you came to this particular boarding house." He turned his head and looked at her. She kept her eyes on the mountains, but she felt his gaze the way you feel warmth from a fire. "So am I," he said. "Very much so." They walked back to town in the winter light, and neither of them said anything more about it, and both of them were smiling, which Pete Garrow saw from the window of the telegraph office and reported to Mrs. Croft at supper that evening with the air of a man delivering important news, and Mrs. Croft received the intelligence with complete satisfaction. It was the sheriff who caused the problem. Sheriff Dan Greer was not a bad man fundamentally, but he was a man who had appointed himself keeper of the town's unofficial social standards, partly from a misguided sense of civic duty, and partly because he was one of those people who requires drama the way other people require water. He had been watching Abraham Mercer with increasing suspicion since the first week of his arrival, not because Abraham had done anything wrong. He emphatically had not, but because Greer had been mildly interested in Hester Blackwell himself for about 2 years, not with any serious intent, but with the possessive laziness of a man who wants to have options. He came to the boarding house one afternoon in early December and asked to speak with Abraham, and Hester showed them to the small sitting room and then went about her business with her back, straightened to a degree that Mrs. Croft, who observed these things, later described as worrying. She could not hear the conversation, but she could hear the tone of it, Greer's voice with its particular carrying quality, the kind of voice that was loud in proportion to the weakness of its arguments, and Abraham's voice quiet and steady underneath it. After about 15 minutes, Greer came out through the hallway, put on his hat in the doorway with the air of a man who had said his piece, and left. Abraham appeared a moment later in the kitchen, where she was making herself busy with the evening bread. "He asked about my business here," he said. "He asked more than that," she said, because she had heard enough to know. He paused. "He suggested that I was perhaps spending more time at this particular boarding house than my professional business required." She punched the bread dough with somewhat more energy than was strictly necessary. "He has been suggesting things about this particular boarding house since I took it over," she said. "He once suggested that a woman alone running a business of this sort was an invitation to misunderstanding. I suggested that the misunderstanding was entirely his." There was a brief pause, and then Abraham said, "He also suggested that I should be cautious about," he used the phrase, "getting involved with a woman of uncertain marital history." The bread dough received another forceful application. She was quiet for a moment. "My marital history is not uncertain," she said. "It is simply unpleasant and unfinished. My husband abandoned me. There was no divorce because he did not trouble himself to arrange one, and the territory's courts have thus far been too occupied with other matters to help me arrange it myself." "I know," he said. She looked up from the bread. "You know. You told me enough that night during the storm that I understood the shape of it," he said. "And the rest isn't difficult to infer if you're paying attention." A pause. "I told Greer that my business here was my own business and that I would thank him to concern himself with matters within his jurisdiction." She looked at him for a long moment. "That likely didn't improve his mood." "No," Abraham agreed. "It didn't, but it needed saying." She went back to the bread. After a moment she said, "It will make things difficult for you in town." "I've handled difficult before," he said. She was quiet again, and then she said very quietly, "I don't want to be a difficulty for you." He came around the end of the kitchen table and stopped on the other side of it from her, close enough that she would have had to deliberately avoid looking at him, which she was no longer willing to do. "Hester," he said, "look at me." She looked. "You are not a difficulty," he said, with a steadiness that reached through every previous voice in her memory and planted itself differently from all of them. "You are the opposite of a difficulty. You are the reason I have extended my stay in Redemption Creek for the 4th time in as many weeks, and I think we are both honest enough to acknowledge that it has not been about the land survey for quite some time." She said nothing. The bread dough sat between them, patient and inert. "I told you I wasn't looking for easy," he said. "I meant it. I'm not afraid of your history or your walls or the particular way you go quiet when something matters to you. I've been watching all of it, and all of it is part of the person I would very much like to have permission to court properly if you are willing." There it was, out in the open like that, plain and direct and impossible to dismiss as imagined. She had known it was coming. She had been building toward this conversation for weeks the way a river builds toward the sea, not sure it was going there until it was already most of the way. And she had been afraid of it, because she was always afraid of the door that opened onto the possibility of being hurt again. And the fear was real, and she was not going to pretend it wasn't. But she was also, she realized, standing in her kitchen with flour on her hands, looking at a man who had in the space of 6 weeks become the person she looked forward to seeing at supper, the person whose quiet on the porch felt like the best kind of company, the person whose voice she had been hearing in her mind saying, "I am looking for you," specifically, like a thing that had been said to her by the better version of the world. "You should know," she said, "that I will still go difficult sometimes. I will still close doors and go quiet. I will not be easy to love. I am not saying this to discourage you. I am saying it because I owe you the truth." "I understand," he said. "I don't think you do," she said. "Not entirely, not yet." "Then teach me," he said. "I'm a fast learner." She looked at him for another moment, and then the corner of her mouth moved in a way that was almost against her will. "That remains to be seen," she said, but she let him court her. That was the thing, she let him. It proceeded as courtship in 1878 in the New Mexico Territory proceeded, which was to say with all the formal and informal rituals of a society that had strong views about decorum, even in the middle of the frontier. There were walks. There were long conversations on the porch in the winter evenings. He brought her a book from the Trading Post, a collection of poems by a New England writer she had not read, and she read it in 2 evenings, and then left it on the breakfast table for him to take back because she said she had finished it. But she noticed he did not take it back, and it remained on the kitchen windowsill, and she looked at it often. He met her formidable practicality with his own. He did not romanticize her life or the labor of it, did not pretend the boarding house was a charming adventure rather than the daily serious work that it was. He helped when he was present without making it a statement about his own virtue. He fixed things when they needed fixing and did not require acknowledgement. He asked her opinion about things and then genuinely listened to what she said and allowed it to change his thinking, which was rarer than it should have been. She began to understand the architecture of him more clearly as the weeks went on. He had his own sorrows. He did not offer them easily, but they were there in the silences he had, the way he sometimes looked at the horizon in the evenings with an expression that had nothing to do with the present view. She learned, piece by piece, that he had lost his brother in the last year of the war, that he had been the one to write the letter home, that it had never quite settled in him despite all the miles and years since. She learned that the moving, the surveying, the perpetual next horizon, it had been, at least in part, the geography of grief, and that he had perhaps traveled himself to a point where he was willing to stop. She recognized that. She recognized the way a person could construct the shape of their life to accommodate a loss they could not name directly. She recognized it because she had done it herself, and recognizing it in him was like finding a landmark in an unfamiliar country, something to orient by. She told him about her mother one evening in January, the long blue dusk settling over the desert while they sat on the front porch with their respective books, the heating lamp between them. Her mother had died when Hester was 12, of a fever not unlike the one that had taken Dora, and the family had come apart quietly after that, the way some families do, not in drama, but in the gradual loosening of connections until each piece finds its own new orbit. Her father had remarried. The new household had not had room for Hester's particular kind of grief or her particular kind of character, and at 17 she had come west to Dora, who had made room for both. "She would have liked you," she told him, meaning Dora. Then she heard herself say it and went quiet because it was an intimate thing to say. "Tell me about her," he said, so she did. She told him about Dora in a way she had not told anyone. The warmth and the stubbornness and the bad paintings and the extraordinary pie crust, and the way she had argued with both churches simultaneously and on theological grounds that were, Hester had come to believe, almost certainly correct. She told him about the way Dora had received her 15 years old, rail-thin, furious at everything, grieving under the fury, and had simply made her work and given her food and space and time until the fury burned down to something more manageable, and the grief found its edges. "She saved my life," Hester said, not dramatically but factually. Not in a dramatic way. In the daily accumulation way, which I think is the more important kind. He was quiet for a while. The evening light had gone to gold and then to rose along the mountains. Finally he said, "I think that's true. I think the large gestures get remembered, but it's the daily accumulation that does the actual work." "Is that why you fixed the pump handle?" she asked. He glanced at her. "Among other reasons." She let herself smile at that, fully, not the half-smile she usually kept in reserve. And she watched him see it and felt the warmth of what seeing it did to his face, and thought that there was perhaps something to be said for the daily accumulation after all. Christmas in Redemption Creek was a modest affair. The two churches competed on the matter of decoration, each attempting to out-Pinebow the other, and the result was a main street that smelled wonderfully of evergreen. Mrs. Alvarez, who ran the cantina on the south end, made tamales and sold them from a cart on Christmas Eve with a generosity that was only nominally commercial. The saloon put up a wreath and was still the saloon. Hester made Christmas dinner for the boarding house, which was the tradition, a considerable undertaking that began 3 days before with the organization of a kitchen, the size of which was barely adequate to the ambition of the menu. She made roast chicken because a beef roast was beyond the budget she had set herself, and sage stuffing and sweet potato pie and corn pudding and bread rolls that took 2 days to get right. Abraham appeared in the kitchen doorway on the afternoon of Christmas Eve and looked at the organized chaos of the preparation and said, "Tell me what to do." And she put him to work immediately, which was better than either tenderness or admiration as a response to the situation, and she was grateful for it. They worked together in the kitchen through the afternoon and into the evening with the lamp burning low and the smell of the cooking filling the whole downstairs. And Mrs. Croft brought in coffee at one point and surveyed the scene with an expression of absolute contentment that she was too dignified to remark on, and Pete Garrow came to ask if he could have a roll and was given one and sent back out again. They were alone in the kitchen at around 9 o'clock, the last of the preparations done, the oven tended, the table set for tomorrow. She was tired in the good particular way of having done something complicated well, and she was standing at the kitchen window looking out at the cold, clear night, and he was leaning against the counter behind her, and she could feel his presence in the room the way you can feel warmth even when you are not facing the source. "Thank you," she said, "for the help today. You didn't have to." "I wanted to," he said. She turned around. He was looking at her with a tenderness so direct and unhurried that she felt it like a physical thing, like the warmth she had been thinking of, and she understood with sudden clarity that she was no longer afraid of it the way she had been. Not unafraid exactly. But the fear and the wanting had shifted in their proportions, and the wanting was larger. "Abraham," she said. "Yes," he said. "Merry Christmas," she said. He smiled, slow and warm. "Merry Christmas, Hester." She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him, and she looked up at him, and she could feel herself on the edge of something she had been approaching for months, and she took a breath and let herself be on the edge of it without stepping back. He raised his hand and touched her face, very gently, his thumb at her cheekbone, and she let him. She stood very still and let him, and she felt the closing of something that had been open for a long time, something that had been blowing cold air through her since Thomas Aldrin's letter arrived, since before that even, since her mother died and the world became a place where people left. He did not kiss her that night. He held her face and looked at her with all that direct and particular attention, and then he said softly, "There you are," not meaning where she was standing, meaning something else entirely. And she said very quietly, "Yes." He kissed her the following Sunday, which was New Year's Eve, when the whole town was making whatever noise it could to bring in 1879, and they were standing on the back porch looking at the stars, and she turned to say something and found him looking at her with an intention she recognized, and instead of saying what she had been going to say, she simply waited, and he kissed her, gentle and certain, and she kissed him back. It was not a dramatic first kiss. It was exactly what they were, careful and real, and the beginning of something rather than the culmination of it. She put her hand on his chest and felt the steadiness of him under her palm, and when they separated she kept her hand there for a moment and he covered it with his. "I'm going to take very good care of you," he said. "I want you to know that." She felt the old resistance rise automatically, the instinct to say she did not need taking care of, that she had managed perfectly well on her own. That care was a kind of condescension dressed in kindness. She felt it rise and she acknowledged it and she set it aside, because she had been listening to it for years and it had not served her, and because what he meant was not that she was incapable but that she was worth the effort of caring for, which was a different thing entirely. "I know," she said. "I think I know." "That's enough for now," he said. January brought changes. Abraham's land survey was complete, the legal documentation sent to Santa Fe, his professional reason for being in Redemption Creek technically concluded. She knew it, and he knew it, and neither of them pretended otherwise. He came to her on a Wednesday morning with his hat in his hands, which was how she had first seen him, and she found herself in the strange position of holding both the memory of that first sight and the present one simultaneously, the distance between them measured in everything that had happened in the intervening months. "I need to talk to you about what comes next," he said. "Yes," she said. She sat down at the kitchen table and he sat across from her, and between them was no bread dough this time, just the plain wood of the table and the morning light coming through the window. "I have work that will take me north in the spring," he said. "Into Colorado." "It's government contracted, 3 months, maybe 4, she nodded slowly. "I understand. But before that," he said, "I have some things to settle, things that have needed settling for a while and that I can settle here if." He paused. "Hester, I'm not asking you to make any decisions you are not ready to make. I know what trust costs you and I know it takes time, but I want you to know that I am not going anywhere permanently. Not from here. Not from you. If you can tell me there is something here worth coming back to, then I would like to come back from Colorado in the autumn, and if you are willing, ask you to marry me." The morning light lay on the table between them. She thought about Thomas Aldrin's letter feeding the kitchen fire. She thought about Dora's bad paintings. She thought about the pump handle on the back porch. She thought about "I am looking for you" specifically. "I am still technically married to Thomas Aldrin," she said. "I know," he said. "I have looked into the legal process. The territory courts can grant an abandonment dissolution. It requires documentation and a filing fee and about 4 months. If you want me to, I would like to help you start that process." She looked at him. "You looked into it." "I did," he said, "several weeks ago." "You were that certain?" she asked. "I was that hopeful," he said. "There's a difference, but I was working hard on the former." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the January wind moved through the narrow streets of Redemption Creek, and somewhere on the main road a horse went by at a steady walk, and the boarding house stood around them in its familiar solidity, the place she had made hers out of grief and determination, and the example of a woman who had stayed when staying was hard. "Yes," she said, "there is something here worth coming back to." She met his eyes. "There is considerable something." He reached across the table and took her hand in both of his, and she let him hold it and did not pull away. "4 months," he said. "And then I'll come back and ask you properly." "You've never done anything improperly in your life," she said. He laughed, and she loved the sound of it in her kitchen on a Wednesday morning in January, loved it with the sudden force of a thing that has been accumulating for months and finally tips over into recognition. She loved him. The thought arrived with the simplicity of water finding level. She loved him, and for once the arrival of that knowledge did not send her looking for the nearest exit. He began the legal process before he left for his Colorado survey in early March. She had gathered the documentation. She had Thomas Aldrin's letter, which she had in fact kept after all, carefully folded in a tin box in her dresser drawer, knowing she might need it someday. The county agent had been cooperative, the filing had been completed, and the matter was in the hands of the territorial court, which Abraham's attorney in Santa Fe confirmed would likely resolve by late summer. The morning he left was clear and cold, the mountains sharp against the sky. The boarding house residents had said their goodbyes at breakfast. Mrs. Croft had shaken his hand with considerable feeling and told him to be careful, which was probably the warmest thing she was capable of expressing, and which he received accordingly. Pete Garrow had shaken his hand and said he hoped to see him back soon, which was genuine because Pete had developed a real liking for Abraham over the months. Calloway had said nothing but had nodded, which from Calloway was the equivalent of a testimonial dinner. Hester walked out to the hitching post with him. He secured his saddlebag and checked the bay horse's cinch with the thoroughness of a man who had been traveling for years and knew all the consequences of insufficient attention to tack. Then he turned to her. "Write to me," he said. "The postal address in Denver is CO the survey office. I've left it for you on the kitchen table." "I will," she said. "And Hester." He reached out and tucked a loose strand of her dark red hair back behind her ear, and she stood still under the tenderness of it. "Take care of yourself while I'm gone, not just the house. You," she swallowed. "You too," she said, which covered considerably more ground than it appeared to. He kissed her, brief and certain, and then he was on the horse and heading north, and she stood at the hitching post until the road was empty and the dust had settled. And then she went back inside to her house and her work, and the letters she was already composing in her head. They wrote to each other through the spring and into summer, and the letters became one of the fixed points of her days, writing them, which she did every Sunday morning, and reading his, which arrived in the irregular rhythms of the postal system, with a reliability that was more emotional than chronological. His letters were what he was, direct and observant and warm without performance. He described the Colorado landscape with the precise eye of his profession and the feeling of a man who had learned to love the land he measured. He described the people he met with a fair-minded interest that she recognized as characteristic. He said things about her, and about what he was looking forward to that she read more than once and kept in the tin box in her dresser alongside Thomas Aldrin's letter, because she liked the idea of the old and the new in the same container, the evidence of where she had come from and where she was going. She wrote back with equal candor. She wrote about the house and the boarders and the particular comedy and tragedy of a small town in the territory moving through its seasons. She wrote about a dispute between the two churches that had escalated to the sheriff's involvement and which she had opinions about. She wrote about the dissolution proceeding, which arrived in the summer with the territorial court's approval, the abandonment dissolution granted on the grounds of 4 years' desertion. Hester Blackwell, once again Hester Blackwell in law as she had always been in practice. She wrote that news to him in a letter that she sent express, which cost extra but which seemed justified by the occasion. His reply came back express also, and it said, among several other things, simply, "Good. Now I can ask you properly when I return." She read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in August, with Mrs. Croft sitting across from her, very obviously not reading her own letter while watching Hester's face for information. "Well," Mrs. Croft said after approximately 15 seconds. "He's coming back in October," Hester said. Mrs. Croft put down her letter. And we will see," Hester said. "We will see," Mrs. Croft repeated, in a tone that suggested this was the least satisfying possible answer, and she intended to extract better eventually. September passed. October arrived with its blue and gold clarity, the desert cooling into the best of itself, the light going long and amber in the afternoons. Hester repainted the sign above the door of the boarding house. She was not sure why, only that it seemed like a reasonable thing to do, and that the old sign had been flaking for some time, and that she wanted the house to look its best. She told herself that was the only reason. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon. She was changing linens in the front room, which was how this had all begun, but this time when she heard the horse on the road she went to the window and recognized the bay from 100 yards away, and she felt a thing in her chest that was too large for the category she had kept it in all summer and was going to have to be reclassified. She went downstairs. She did not run. She walked, with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a person who has decided they are not afraid and is holding that decision steady. He came through the door without slamming it, still. He looked at her and she looked at him, and whatever had accumulated in the months between them filled the hallway of Blackwell House from floor to ceiling. "You repainted the sign," he said. "It was flaking," she said. "It looks good," he said. She took a breath. "So do you," she said, which was the kind of direct thing she had been learning to say, and she watched it reach him. He crossed the hallway in 3 steps and kissed her properly this time, with the full weight of everything that had been restrained in letters and months. And she kissed him back with equal weight, her hands on the front of his dusty coat, and the house stood around them in its familiar solidity. And it felt, for the first time since she had inherited it, like a home in the deepest sense of the word. Not just a structure she maintained, but a place where she was known and wanted. When they separated, she said, a little breathless, "You said you were going to ask me properly." "I am," he said. "I need about 10 minutes to clean up from the road." She laughed. She actually laughed fully, and he looked at her with an expression that she could only describe as dazzled, which she filed away to think about later. He asked her that evening, on the front porch in the October dusk, with the mountains going to purple and the first stars appearing. He had cleaned up as promised, and he was himself again, steady, direct, with the particular warmth he kept banked low but that she had learned to recognize at any temperature. He did not get down on one knee, which would not have suited either of them, and which she had never particularly wanted anyway. He simply took her hands in his and looked at her and said, "Hester Blackwell, I have been looking for a reason to stop moving for a long time, and I have found it, and it is you. I would like to spend the rest of my life learning everything you have to teach me and building something in this place that is ours. Will you marry me?" She held his hands and looked at him in the fading light, and she thought of the woman she had been the October before, standing at this same door telling herself she had made her peace with being alone. She thought of what it had cost her to open the door and what it had given her to open it. She thought of all the daily accumulation, the pump handle and the flowers and the storm and the kitchen at Christmas, and the months of letters that had mapped the interior of a person more thoroughly than any survey. "Yes," she said, "I will." He pulled her close, and she let herself be held, really held, without the flinch and the retreat. And standing in the October dusk on the porch of her boarding house in Redemption Creek, she felt something settle in her that had not been settled in a very long time, the particular peace of a person who has found, against considerable odds and their own best defenses, the place where they belong. They were married in December, which the whole town of Redemption Creek treated as an event of community significance. Mrs. Croft organized the flowers with a thoroughness that suggested she had been planning this for some time. Pete Garrow was so moved at the ceremony that he cried, which he denied afterward with some heat. Calloway came in his army dress coat and said nothing, but looked genuinely pleased, which for Calloway was practically a standing ovation. Even Sheriff Greer had the decency to shake Abraham's hand and mumble something that was at least approximately congratulatory, which Abraham received graciously because he was that kind of man. The ceremony was held in the larger of the 2 churches, which had won the honor partly by having a slightly better building and partly because its minister, Reverend Hollies, was the only person in Redemption Creek who could conduct a service without making the participants feel judged, which Hester had always considered the primary qualification for the job. She wore a dress of deep green, not white. She was 28 years old and had been married before and had no interest in the pretense of white, and the deep green suited her dark red hair in a way that made Abraham stop when she came down the stairs that morning and stand very still for a moment. "You look extraordinary," he said. "Stop looking like that," she told him. "I'll start crying, and I never cry." "You can cry," he said. "I'll still think you look extraordinary." She did not cry. She came close twice. They settled into a life together in Blackwell House with a naturalness that still sometimes surprised her. He had taken a position with the county surveying office in Santa Fe, which kept him in the territory and allowed him to base himself in Redemption Creek. He still traveled for work, sometimes for a week or two, but he came home, which was the operative word home, to the house that was now theirs together in a way that changed the quality of every room. She was not easy. She had told him she wouldn't be, and she was honest about it. There were times she went quiet and had to be given space. There were times she pushed when she should have let things rest. There were times the old walls went up with such speed that she was barely aware it had happened until she was standing behind them looking out. He learned to recognize the shape of those moments without making them into crises. He had his own difficulties. The grief for his brother that came around sometimes in dreams he didn't want to talk about. The occasional remoteness that she recognized as kin to her own. They navigated each other's difficult weather with the growing skill of two people who have decided that the weather does not define the country. She found that the act of being loved, truly and persistently and without condition, did something to the architecture she had built around herself. It did not demolish it. It never worked that way, not for people who had built as carefully as she had. But it made the walls thinner and the doors opened more often, and eventually there were windows everywhere that had once been solid, not because she had been changed into a different person, but because she had been shown, slowly and thoroughly, that the person she was could be loved, as she was. With the walls and the silence and the tendency to push and all of it, that was the thing he had given her, not rescue, not the dissolution of difficulty. The proof that she was lovable in her particularity, not in some theoretical improved version of herself. She told him this on an evening in their first spring together, sitting on the front porch in the warm April air, when the desert was in the brief green extravagance that the spring rains allowed it, and he listened to her say it with the usual quality of his attention, and then said simply, "Of course you are. That was never in question." "It was in question to me," she said. "I know," he said. "That's what I've been working on." She took his hand and held it. "You have done good work," she said. "Highest praise I've ever received," he said. She was 3 months along with their first child by the summer of 1880, which she told him on a Thursday morning in July while he was eating breakfast. She had been planning a more deliberate announcement, but the words had simply come out while she was pouring his coffee, the way important things often did with her, not in the prepared speeches she occasionally drafted, but in the unrehearsed moments when her defenses were down, and the truth got out before she could second-guess the delivery. He sat with the news for a moment in that considering way he had, and then he set down his coffee cup and stood up from the table and came around to her and took both her hands in both of his and said nothing, which was exactly right. She felt tears coming and let them, which was a thing she was learning, a certain selectivity about what was worth the emotion. "Are you frightened?" he asked gently. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "Terrified," he said. "Also more glad than I have words for." "That about covers it," she said. He kissed her hair. She leaned into him, and outside the boarding house window the July morning was already warm and golden, and inside the house the smell of coffee and bread and the good particular smell of a place that is lived in well surrounded them. And Hester Blackwell, who had told herself for years that she was not made for this, for being held, for being known, for the daily accumulation of a life shared with someone who chose her specifically, let herself believe otherwise. Mrs. Croft, informed at supper, cried. She denied it for years afterward. Their son arrived in January of 1881 during another storm because apparently it was their weather. He was a large and emphatic infant who arrived with considerable noise and who had Abraham's dark hair and Hester's copper-colored eyes, and they named him Edmund for Abraham's brother and Dora for Hester's aunt Edmund Doran Mercer, which was a long name for a small person, but which he seemed to grow into with reasonable speed. The birth had been difficult, and Hester had been exhausted afterward in a way that stretched into weeks, and Abraham had managed the boarding house during that time, with a competence that surprised exactly no one who knew him and which reduced Hester, when she was well enough to observe it, to the complicated emotion of being genuinely taken care of without the familiar instinct to resist it. "You are managing my house," she said, from the chair she was confined to by the doctor's orders, watching him carry a stack of clean linens upstairs. "Our house," he said without stopping. "Our house," she agreed, and the words settled on her like the best kind of weight. Edmund grew. He was an energetic child, opinionated from an early age and possessed of a social confidence that he had clearly gotten from neither of his parents, who took note of this with equal parts pride and bewilderment. He attached himself to Mrs. Croft with a devotion that she pretended to find merely tolerable, and which actually made her entirely happy. He followed Calloway around the porch on Saturday mornings with a solemn attention that the old soldier received with gruff pleasure. He called Pete Garrow by his first name, which Pete found endearing and which Hester felt she should probably address and never quite did. Redemption Creek continued to be Redemption Creek, which was to say imperfect, noisy, occasionally ridiculous, and alive in the way that only a place full of difficult human beings can be alive. The two churches eventually agreed on one point of theology, though they discovered two new points of disagreement the following week. The saloon remained the saloon. The gully that had been the creek became, over the years, a kind of informal park where people gathered in the evenings and children played in the afternoon, which was perhaps the most appropriate outcome for a dry place that had once been water. Abraham continued his survey work, and Hester continued to run the boarding house, and they built it together in the way of the daily accumulation, not without difficulty, not without the occasional storm both literal and otherwise, but with the fundamental competence of two people who had chosen each other with open eyes and full knowledge of what they were getting, and who made the same choice, in the small ways, every day. She found him on the back porch one October evening when Edmund was 2 years old, standing at the rail looking at the mountains in the last light, and she came and stood beside him, and he put his arm around her without looking, and she leaned into his side. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I was thinking that this is exactly where I meant to end up," he said. "When I was riding from territory to territory with no particular destination, this is approximately what I was looking for, though I didn't know it was a boarding house in New Mexico and a woman who told me in the first week that she couldn't be loved easily." "I did say that," she said. "You did," he said. "And you were right, by the way. You are not easy to love in the sense of simple or uncomplicated or requiring nothing." She looked up at him. "And yet here you are." "Here I am," he agreed, looking down at her with everything that 8 years of daily accumulation had put in his face, all the warmth and the steadiness and the humor and the knowing of her. "Because I was never looking for easy. I was looking for you." She held that and let it settle, and outside the October light went gold and then rose on the mountains that remembered everything. And inside the house she could hear Edmund's particular mode of movement, a kind of emphatic trotting that announced itself around corners, and the smell of the supper she had started was drifting out through the open door, and Mrs. Croft was saying something in the kitchen in the tone she used when she was right about something and wanted acknowledgement. And the boarding house that Hester had inherited from grief and stubbornness and love was warm and lit and full, and she was home. She turned and kissed Abraham on the jaw, which was where she could reach without effort, and he turned and kissed her properly. And they stood on the back porch of Blackwell House in the last of the October light, and neither of them said anything for a while because there was nothing that needed saying that was not already there between them. In the house and the history, and the two names on the sign that she had repainted before he came back, more hopeful even then than she had been willing to admit. Hester and Abraham Mercer, not on the sign, which still read Blackwell House, because the house remembered Dora and she was not going to change that. But in everything else that mattered, in the ledger of their days and the accumulation of their years, in the child who had Edmund's name and Dora's middle name and would grow up knowing both stories, in the particular piece of two people who had found each other in the middle of the desert and decided that the finding was worth staying for. The mountains held the last of the light. Edmund came to the back door and said something unintelligible but emphatic. The supper was nearly ready. The night was coming in clear and cold, full of stars. She was not easy to love, and she never entirely stopped being difficult in the precise ways she had always been difficult, and she never pretended otherwise. And Abraham Mercer had known that from the second week of his residence at Blackwell House and had stayed through every difficulty and returned from every absence, and said in the wordless daily language of a man who means what he does rather than merely what he says, "I am here. I chose this. I choose it still." It was not the romantic story that the dime novels sold. It was better than that. It was the true and specific thing, the love that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the willingness to meet it together, day after day, in the ordinary and extraordinary accumulation of a life. She had told him she could not be loved easily. He had not been looking for easy. He had found her, and she had found him, and between them in the New Mexico territory in the years that followed, they built something that had the quality of water that has finally reached the level it was always seeking, patient, persistent, and once arrived, at rest.